The night skies over Earth had never looked so calm, so quiet, and so unaware of the horror slowly creeping toward them. Without any warning, no sound, and no bright flashes of light, the Trivax Empire began its invasion not with fire or destruction, but with silence, shadows, and perfect timing. Their plan was simple and brutal. They would strike at Earth's heart, not its cities or armies, but its children. The Trivax believed this method would crush the human spirit without wasting resources. They had done this before to weaker species, and it had always worked. But this time, they had chosen the wrong planet. Across the globe, thousands of children vanished in one single coordinated event. Schools, homes, and even hospitals became scenes of confusion and helplessness. Parents cried out. Security cameras caught only flickers of strange blue light. Authorities tried to explain it as a strange phenomenon. But soon the truth became impossible to hide. The children were taken, and nothing remained except silence. Earth, a world full of noise, suddenly became quiet. No threats were made, no ransom sent, just a message broadcast from deep space in a language quickly decoded. They are now under the care of the Trivax Empire. Surrender is expected, but Earth did not respond. In their command ship orbiting one of Jupiter's moons, the Trivax leaders waited for panic, for madness to take over the humans, but they were met with a strange growing unease. The humans did not break. World governments met behind closed doors. Military satellites were repositioned. Old, forgotten bunkers lit up again. The Trivax didn't understand. This was not how things were supposed to go. Earth's silence was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of planning. Somewhere in an old military base buried deep beneath a mountain, a general stared at a black screen and simply said, "Now they've made it personal." Across oceans, scientists stopped their research and began building things that hadn't been tested in decades. Retired soldiers picked up encrypted calls and packed their gear without saying a word to their families. Something was happening, something ancient and powerful, not driven by orders or money, but by love, fury, and something only humans truly understood, the unstoppable force of a parent protecting their child. The Trivax were proud of their strategy. They had avoided bloodshed. They thought they had broken Earth without a single weapon fired. But slowly, strange reports began surfacing in their fleet. A transport ship went missing during its route to the main research facility. An outpost on Mars lost contact. Surveillance systems picked up strange distortions in space near Earth's moon, but nothing visible appeared. When the Trivax scanned for weapons, they found nothing. No mass movements, no nuclear launches, no battle fleets, but something was watching them. Something human, and it wasn't afraid. It was waiting for the perfect moment. Inside the holding chambers aboard the Trivax motherships, the children sat quietly, not panicking like the Trivax expected. Some of them were whispering to each other. Some of them were memorizing guard movements. One girl, only 8 years old, stared into the security camera and smiled. When a Trivax guard asked her why, she replied with terrifying calm, "My father's coming. And he's not alone." The guard laughed nervously, but something deep inside him felt cold. These children were not behaving like captives. They were learning, adapting. And that was something the Trivax had never seen before. On Earth, humanity had not broken. It had awakened. Across continents, hidden programs were activated. AI systems, long considered too dangerous to use, were switched back online. Human-built satellites began to pulse with signals that didn't match any known code. Underground labs started transmitting strange energy signatures. And still, Earth said nothing. No declaration of war. No public anger. Just action. Precise. Focused. Silent. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. A storm the Trivax could not predict. General Vorth, leader of the invasion, watched the Earth from his war room. He was proud of his people's achievement, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This mission had been too easy. There was no resistance, no real fight. And now his soldiers were sending nervous messages, reports of seeing shadows moving where no one was, lights blinking in patterns that didn't make sense, internal systems glitching without reason. He dismissed them at first, but the fear in his officers' voices grew louder each day. One of his communication officers, normally calm and loyal, approached him trembling. "Sir," he whispered, "they're not attacking. But it feels like they are already inside." Vorth narrowed his eyes and walked to the observation window. Earth spun silently below them. No war, no chaos, just the waiting blue planet, watching. He had once studied human history. He remembered reading about how humans reacted when threatened. They didn't always act right away. Sometimes they waited, not because they were afraid, but because they were planning something terrifying. Vorth turned back to his maps and saw a small blinking red light near the asteroid belt. A missing ship, then another, and another. 3 gone. No sign of damage, no distress call. Just gone. His heart, if it could be called that, began to race. The silence of Earth was no longer peaceful. It was dangerous, deadly. Something was coming, and it wasn't a fleet. It wasn't a weapon. It was something else, something human, and it was already here. General Vorth stood in the middle of the command deck, his long shadow stretched across the glowing floor as the silence grew heavier with every passing hour. The screen ahead showed Earth, still calm, still quiet, still unchanged. There were no signs of attack, no radio threats, no desperate attempts to negotiate for the return of the children. It had been 2 weeks since the Trivax Empire took thousands of Earth's young. Yet not a single missile had been launched. Not even a single drone had lifted into orbit. This was not how humans were expected to react. The Trivax were confused. Other species they had conquered had fallen apart within days, crying, surrendering, even offering more of their people in fear. But Earth had gone dark in a different way. Surveillance picked up no unusual movements, but somehow a strange uneasiness crept into the hearts of even the most loyal Trivax soldiers. It was the kind of fear that had no shape, no sound, just a cold presence that followed them like a shadow. Some began whispering stories about things they had seen. Ships vanishing without warning, weapons failing to power on, and odd sounds echoing through corridors where no one was walking. The Trivax were starting to believe they had made a mistake. On Earth, the streets remained full of life, but underneath that normal appearance, everything had changed. Human leaders gave no public speeches, and the media said little beyond the official statement. "We are handling it." But behind closed doors, every nation had united in silent rage. In secret bunkers, once buried beneath mountains and oceans, humans activated systems they hadn't used in decades. Cyber warfare units began working in total silence, connecting old satellites with new AI minds built to learn and strike without emotion. Entire defense programs, kept hidden from even their own allies, were now operational. But still, Earth sent no message to the stars. No request for peace. No declaration of war. Just a growing silence that was more terrifying than an army. Vorth watched this silence closely and grew more unsettled with each passing day. He started to wonder if Earth's quietness was a strategy, not fear. Maybe they weren't broken. Maybe they were preparing for something far worse than war. Within the Trivax motherships, small malfunctions began to increase. One by one, internal sensors started showing false readings, hallways appearing empty when soldiers were walking through them, locked doors opening by themselves, and cameras going dark at exactly the same time across multiple ships. It was too perfect to be a coincidence. And yet, no sign of physical attack was found. The Trivax engineers searched for answers but found nothing. One by one, a quiet panic began to spread through the crews. Something was happening, but it was invisible, unstoppable. When General Vorth asked his technicians to trace any strange signals coming from Earth, they found faint energy patterns pulsing from deep underground. Not powerful enough to attack, but too complex to be ignored. The code within the signal was strange, part human, part something else, something smarter. A learning code, a living one. It was as if Earth's silence wasn't just a lack of noise. It was a quiet conversation, happening beneath their feet, that the Trivax couldn't understand. Meanwhile, within the holding chambers where the human children were kept, things took an even stranger turn. Guards reported that the children were becoming more coordinated. Without speaking, they began moving in patterns, lining up, changing positions, responding to each other with nods or glances. They refused to show fear. Some even stared directly into the guards' eyes without blinking. When questioned, they answered politely, but there was something in their voices, too calm, too focused. One boy asked a guard how fast the ship could travel. Another asked how thick the walls were. A girl, barely 6 years old, smiled and said, "You shouldn't have brought us here. You won't like what's coming." The Trivax commanders thought it was just childish confidence, but the scientists working on studying the children began to notice strange brain activity. Their minds were adapting rapidly, faster than any species they had encountered before. Memory, coordination, emotional control, all increasing at unnatural levels. And somehow, despite being separated, the children were starting to act as one. The lead scientist requested more time, more control, and better security. But by the time his report was delivered, 2 more guards had vanished during a night shift. No signs of struggle, just empty armor on the floor. Back in space, 3 more Trivax scout ships disappeared while on patrol near Earth's orbit. The black box recordings retrieved from one of them showed something unbelievable. Just static, followed by a single voice whispering, "They are not ready for us." After that, nothing but silence. General Vorth ordered the surrounding ships to stay on high alert. But even then, systems continued to glitch. Maps began to mislead. Communications dropped at random. Even the lighting in some corridors flickered as though something was interfering from inside. The engineers still claimed there were no signs of attack, no weapons launched, but Vorth knew better. Earth's silence was not empty. It was filled with purpose. Something was crawling beneath their sensors, between their defenses, and inside their systems. The humans hadn't vanished. They were hiding in the wires, moving through code, watching every step. The Trivax had always considered humans a young species, emotional and unpredictable. But now they were starting to understand a terrifying truth. The humans were not unprepared. They were simply patient. They had allowed the Trivax to take their children not out of fear, but because they knew something the Trivax didn't. Something old, something deadly, something waiting for the right moment to strike. Vorth's dreams became haunted by shadows moving through steel walls and quiet voices calling his name. His officers grew restless. The fear that once belonged to the humans was now theirs. And Earth, still spinning silently below, had not said a single word. Inside the cold metal chambers of the Trivax flagship, something impossible was happening. The human children, taken from Earth under the belief that they were weak and easy to control, were slowly becoming the center of growing fear among the alien crew. At first, they seemed quiet. Too quiet for children separated from their families and planet. But that silence was not fear. It was focus. They did not cry or panic like the other species the Trivax had captured in the past. Instead, they observed everything around them. They studied the routines of the guards, memorized the layout of the hallways, and noticed every blinking light, every hiss of the vents, every pattern in the aliens' behavior. When the Trivax doctors came to examine their minds, they found something disturbing. The children were learning too fast. Their brain activity showed spikes not seen in any other species, not even in adult humans. Neural growth, memory strength, coordination, even their ability to stay calm under stress. It was all beyond expected levels. But it wasn't just the science that scared the Trivacs. It was the strange way the children acted like they were connected. They would speak softly among themselves, barely moving their lips, as if they didn't need words at all. Sometimes, they would all turn at the exact same time to look at the same camera or guard, as though responding to a signal no one else could hear. A young Trivax officer, still in training, tried to test one of the children by asking them complex questions about space, energy, and alien biology, expecting confusion. But the child answered each one slowly, clearly, and correctly. The officer laughed nervously, thinking it was a trick, until the child leaned closer and asked, "Do you know what fear smells like?" That officer never came back to the holding chamber. Later, security found his armor abandoned in the hallway, with no signs of struggle. The higher command grew uneasy and doubled the guards around the children. They increased the surveillance, ordered more scans, and tried to limit contact. But even the machines began to fail. Cameras would freeze when the children passed by. Audio feeds would cut out during conversations. Drones sent into the chamber would stop moving and crash without warning. One engineer claimed the children were talking to the ship, though no one believed him. He was sent for mental evaluation, then vanished during his transfer. The fear was spreading. Some of the Trivacs whispered that the children had powers. Others believed they were spies trained from birth. But none of those theories explained how the youngest among them, a girl no older than 4, had caused a full power failure on Deck 9, just by staring at the lights above her. Back on Earth, old defense satellites were quietly reactivated, but not by generals or presidents, by hidden programs buried deep in military systems, triggered only by specific patterns of global silence. These programs were not part of any known government. They were part of a secret legacy passed down through generations of human thinkers, scientists, and warriors who knew that one day something like this would happen. The children taken by the Trivacs were not chosen by chance. They were selected by the invaders based on false data, records that had been manipulated by humans long ago. The ones taken were not ordinary. Each child had a different kind of mind. Some were gifted with perfect memory, some with pattern recognition, others with emotional control or advanced logic. They had been raised quietly, without attention, trained not as soldiers, but as weapons of intelligence. The world called them children. The enemy had just made the mistake of calling them harmless. Now they were inside the enemy's ship, and they were no longer waiting. Within the flagship, one of the guards entered the holding area and stopped in shock. The children were not in their cells. They were sitting calmly in the center of the room, forming a perfect circle. No alarms had gone off. No doors had been broken. And yet, every security system said the room was locked and normal. The children looked up in unison, and one of the boys spoke in a calm voice. "You don't need to be here anymore." The guard raised his weapon in fear, but then his hands began to shake. A loud ringing filled his ears. He dropped the weapon and fell to his knees, eyes wide, unable to speak. One of the children walked over and touched his shoulder gently. His body relaxed, but his mind never recovered. He was later found in a storage room, drawing strange symbols on the walls and whispering about eyes in the code. The Trivax leadership ordered a full lockdown and sent their elite enforcers to contain the situation. But by the time they arrived, the chamber was empty. No children, no guards, only silence. What the Trivacs didn't know was that the children had never planned to escape in the way the aliens expected. They weren't looking for open doors. They were looking for systems to control. Every moment they spent inside the ship, they were learning how the engines worked, how the communications flowed, how the ship responded to orders. They didn't need weapons. They were becoming the weapon. They didn't need to run. They were turning the entire ship into their battlefield. One by one, lights across the flagship began to flicker in a pattern. Then, strange sounds started echoing through the halls. Not alarms, but human voices, children singing in soft, eerie harmony. The sounds traveled through the walls, carried by frequencies too strange to block. Trivax soldiers panicked. Some began firing into empty hallways. Others locked themselves in storage rooms. The commanders shouted orders, but many systems no longer responded. Doors closed on their own. Maps became unreadable. The ship had become a maze, and the children were guiding it. General Vorth stood frozen in the central control room, watching as every screen around him turned black. Then, slowly, one by one, the screens lit up again, not with star maps or system reports, but with the faces of the children. Not angry, not scared, just calm, observing, calculating. And then, as if they had been waiting for the perfect moment, the oldest child among them spoke across the entire fleet's communication system. "You took us to break our people, but we are not broken. We are the answer. You're inside the test now." Then silence returned. Real, complete silence. And it was the most terrifying sound the Trivax had ever heard. Across the vast emptiness of space, the Trivax fleet had become silent and dark, as if a great shadow had wrapped itself around their once powerful warships. Inside the flagship, the command center flickered with low emergency lighting, casting strange reflections on the alien walls. No one spoke. No one moved. The children, those taken from Earth, had vanished from the cells without a trace, yet the ship still echoed with the soft hum of systems turning on and off by themselves, lights blinking in unusual rhythms, and sounds leaking through the vents like whispers from the dark. General Vorth sat alone, eyes locked on the blackened control screens. He wasn't waiting for orders anymore. There were no more orders to give. The chain of command had crumbled. Crew members had abandoned their posts, hiding in storage bays, or trying to seal themselves inside the escape pods, which no longer responded to commands. Some even spoke of seeing figures moving through the hallways, shapes that weren't children nor Trivax, but something else entirely, something darker, something born inside the silence. That's when it became clear. The children hadn't just taken over the ship. They had awakened something deep within it, something that was not supposed to exist. Long ago, before the Trivax became a dominant force in the galaxy, they had discovered ancient technology buried within a forgotten world. They used that knowledge to build their ships, their weapons, and their empire. But there was a warning written in that forgotten code, a pattern in the machines they never fully understood. The Trivax ignored it, believing themselves to be the masters of all they found. But now, inside their flagship, the code had changed. The children had touched it, and something old, something patient, had finally opened its eyes. The lights across the ship dimmed even more. Artificial gravity began to shift. Sounds grew louder, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone, slow breathing in places where no life signs were detected, and data files rewriting themselves with symbols that no Trivax could translate. Some of the crew began to mutter nonsense, as if speaking in a forgotten language. Others simply froze in place, eyes wide, as if watching something that no one else could see. Panic turned into dread. The word shadows started spreading among the survivors. The children weren't alone anymore. Whatever they had awakened was now moving. In the lower decks, a research officer named Creel tried to understand what was happening. He accessed the ship's core memory and found an old file, buried under layers of firewalls and false systems. It had no name, only a symbol, a human hand surrounded by a spiral of stars. He opened it, and his screen filled with a single message, written in perfect human English. "We were never your experiment. You were ours." Then the lights went out, and Creel screamed. What the Trivax had never known was that humanity's greatest strength wasn't just survival, it was adaptation. And these children, chosen carefully from Earth by hidden forces long before the Trivax invasion, were not just humans. They were keys, each mind designed to unlock a part of the ancient code buried within alien machines. As the children walked the silent corridors, they began to feel it. The ship was alive in a new way. Not mechanical, Not digital, but something in between. A living shadow born from both human thought and alien history. The walls responded to their presence, doors opening with a soft hiss, not because of programming, but as if the ship now recognized them as part of itself. Above, the rest of the Trivax fleet began to lose contact with the flagship. Ships tried to send messages, but nothing returned. Some moved closer to investigate, but as they did, they too began to suffer strange malfunctions. Their engines stalled without reason. Navigation systems spun in circles. Then the shadows appeared on their decks. Brief, dark shapes just beyond the lights. No alarms, no attacks, just fear that settled in like poison. The Trivax had believed they were fighting humans, but the truth was far more terrifying. They had invited something ancient into their ships, something hiding inside humanity, waiting for a way in. Now, awakened by the minds of these children, it was spreading like a quiet storm. Back on Earth, deep underground, an old man watched satellite feeds from hidden screens. He said nothing, only nodded as the signals from the Trivax ships vanished one by one. "It started," he whispered. "The silent invasion is complete." For generations, people had spoken in secret about a time when humanity would stop defending itself and begin something much larger. It wasn't about war. It wasn't about revenge. It was about change. The children were never kidnapped. They were delivered, placed exactly where they needed to be. The Trivax thought they had found a weakness to exploit, but they had opened the door to something they couldn't understand. The children were no longer trying to escape. They were guiding the awakening of the shadows, a force older than the stars, hidden in human potential, now growing inside the alien ships like a seed finally reaching sunlight. Systems began to reboot, but they didn't follow Trivax programming anymore. The ship responded to thought, to emotion, to instinct. One child closed her eyes, and the ship changed direction. Another whispered, and doors opened across 5 decks. The shadows weren't enemies. They were allies, forgotten guardians tied to human minds, hidden by design until the right generation was ready. Now the stars had become silent witnesses to the return of a force that would reshape the galaxy, not with weapons, but with something much deeper. Evolution through fear, intelligence, and control. The last broadcast from the Trivax fleet was a message filled with static and a voice. Young, calm, human. You feared us as children. You feared us as humans, but you should have feared what watches with us from the dark. After that, there was nothing. No more signals. No more fleet. Just silence. Deep, final silence. Across the galaxy, other empires listened. Some prepared for war. Others shut down communication with Earth. But no one dared to approach the silent region, where the Trivax fleet had once floated proudly. Something had awakened there, something wearing the shape of children, something born of shadows and stars. And now, the galaxy would never be the same. General Terex stood alone on the edge of the command deck, staring out at the dying stars as silence fell across the bridge. For most of his life, he had been trained to believe humans were inferior, primitive, emotional, chaotic creatures that only survived by accident, not design. The Trivax Empire had studied them, dissected their culture, mocked their unpredictable nature, and still failed to understand how Earth remained unconquered for so long. Now, as reports of entire fleets going dark filled the room, the truth began to weigh on him like a mountain crushing his chest. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something was deeply wrong. They had taken human children, thinking they were soft targets, but strange incidents followed. Shadows moving on their own, systems locking up without cause, soldiers going mad without reason. One by one, his best commanders had lost their minds or vanished without a trace. The flagship itself felt different now, colder, darker, as if the ship no longer obeyed him but watched him instead. Files rewritten, security logs corrupted, voices heard through intercoms that hadn't worked in days, all dismissed at first as glitches or sabotage, but now the evidence was impossible to ignore. What haunted him most was the look in the eyes of the last child he interrogated. A calm, steady gaze that didn't plead or cry, only watched him like he was the experiment. That gaze had followed him in his dreams, and when he woke, the child was gone. No broken door, no escape route, just an empty cell and a strange message scrawled in perfect Trivax script. You are not ready for what you've touched. At first, he thought it was a prank. Now it felt like a warning too late. The truth, terrible and vast, began to settle in his mind. They hadn't kidnapped children. They had unleashed something ancient, something connected to humanity that even Earth itself might not fully understand. A force buried in their minds, or maybe in their very DNA, something that only awoke when pushed to the edge. These weren't just kids. They were beacons, triggers, weapons of a kind no empire had ever known. The general, once proud and arrogant, now felt like a fool. He looked around at his dying ship, at the terrified crew whispering about shadows and voices, and he finally understood. Humanity was not weak. They were unreadable, unpredictable, and deeply dangerous. Every calculation had failed because the Trivax had used logic, and humans thrived in chaos. Where Trivax planned war like chess, humans made it feel like wildfire. The realization made his hands shake. They hadn't been fighting soldiers. They had been dancing with something far more terrifying. Every moment they thought they had control, they were being studied, tested, and now perhaps punished. He tried to send a message to High Command, but the console didn't respond. The ship had disconnected itself from the fleet. Lights flickered. A soft humming filled the room, not mechanical but organic, like something alive. His guards refused to enter the command deck, muttering that it felt wrong, cursed even. The general remembered the stories Earth once told, of monsters in the dark, ghosts that whispered truths, and creatures born not of flesh but fear. He never believed in such nonsense. But now, the ship itself seemed to breathe with secrets. The AI no longer answered him. The air grew colder. In the far end of the room, the shadows seemed to move on their own. Terex finally collapsed into the command chair, sweating, trembling, and broken, not because he feared death, but because he realized what he had triggered. This wasn't the end of a mission. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The invasion hadn't failed because the Trivax were weak. It had failed because they had misunderstood the very nature of their enemy. The silence was not surrender. The missing responses weren't signs of defeat. The children weren't just victims. They were the first wave. And now, something was awake. Something older than the Trivax, older perhaps than humanity itself, hidden within their instincts, waiting for someone to make the mistake of calling it out. That someone had been him. And now, sitting in his useless command chair, watching the room dim to black, General Terex understood that the galaxy had changed forever, not because of ships or weapons, but because of what lived inside the human soul. A force that waited quietly, until someone made the mistake of thinking Earth was weak.